Is Christian faith built on evidence or the absence of it? For many, the New Testament is seen as proof of everything from prophecy to salvation. But what happens when belief hinges on faith alone without verifiable proof? Welcome back to Answers from Genesis. I'm Genesis, joined by Alan Bondar, as we take a critical look here at the New Testament. Now, while Christians often rely on it as the ultimate foundation of their beliefs, we're left wondering, does the New Testament actually demand that believers abandon the need for evidence? So today we're going to explore why this ancient text encourages faith without proof and how it keeps millions bound to belief.
Yeah, it's going to be an exciting conversation as we are in chapter 6 of my book, as we continue to move through the book and just kind of, parallel it, but have definitely unique ideas here and thoughts, especially as Jen shares hers, which reminds me, don't forget to take a look at the book on Amazon. You can buy it right now. It's finally on sale, and we're excited that it's out. So I hope you take a look at it. How to Kill God the Easy Way is what you're looking for, or you can just look under Alan Bondar. But Jen, what do you say we continue here in our Addicted to God series based on the How to Kill God the Easy Way book?
Yeah, let's, are you ready to set this 30-minute timer? And
let's do it.
All right. All right. I know I'm the only one who can hear this timer, but we've got it going. So, Alan, if the New Testament is the source of Christian truth, why does it seem to insist on faith over tangible evidence? Are Christians like being asked to trust without reason, or is there more to this story?
I think that the fact that the New Testament requires faith alone without evidence, and we're probably going to get into that even in more detail when we finally broach chapter 9 of my book. Here we're on chapter 6, so 2 more chapters of videos, but eventually we're going to get to apologetics, and what we discover from the New Testament is that the entire requirements of everything regarding belief in Christ and even God and his testimony is that you have to just accept what he says by faith alone. There is no evidence, and I think that the original writers must have known that there was no evidence that this was any real type of story, and so they incorporated the faith alone elements into the story. But now, even 2,000 years later, we clearly have no empirical, tangible, testimonial evidence of any sorts to verify that the New Testament is any more than a mining of the Old Testament and bringing forth fulfillments in the New to make it look as though it's one perfect, complete story of God. But no, ultimately it does require faith completely over tangible evidence, because we have none. And that's been where I've ended up, and that's where I've landed, because I can't find anything tangible. But I would love to hear your take on this as well.
So, I think Christians often say that, we know it's true because different people wrote the Old Testament than they wrote the New Testament, and the New Testament clearly shows the fulfillment of all these different prophecies, right? So it's one continuous story, and we can look at all of that. I used to really, really, really believe that the internal evidence was evidence, right? Mm-hmm. That the story was true. Mm-hmm. Then I learned about, and I realized, and it became very, very clear that if you write a story as an ending to another story, it doesn't make it true. So if someone were writing a TV series, right? We have a writer for a TV series, and they write the first 6 seasons, and then somebody else, something happens to them, and somebody else comes along, and they're a good writer, and they write the next 6 seasons, and the story is coherent, and the last 6 seasons make sense of the first 6 seasons, right? And all of the stories are wrapped up with a nice, neat bow. All of the details come, everything happens smoothly. Does it mean that story is now true because, this writer reinforced this writer? Or is that what is happening in the New Testament? So the New Testament, to me, is one of the greatest pieces of literature ever written. I don't know who wrote it. Nobody knows who wrote it. I do know it's not Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. We know that, right? But whoever wrote it was just brilliant at literature. And what they did was they pulled stories from Adam. They pulled stories from Moses. They pulled stories from David. They pulled stories from Elijah. They pulled stories from the Exodus, from Moses. They pulled all of these stories and they had them almost recapitulated in Jesus, right? And so they pulled stories not only from these Old Testament characters and made them look like, Jesus was a accumulation of all of these stories, but they also pulled stories from all of the other mythology gods from around their region, from the Egyptian gods and the Roman gods and the Greek gods and the Syrian gods and the Babylonian gods, all these gods, right? They pulled those stories in and used those as well. And they pulled stories in from other places like Titus, right? So Jesus is also what Jesus did, Titus did. They pulled in stories from Homer. They pulled in stories from all kinds of places. So it's not just this accumulation of, the Old Testament must be true because Jesus fulfilled all of these things that it talks about. No, somebody's just a brilliant writer. This was the Shakespeare of their time. That's how I look at it. What do you think, Alan?
Yeah, Shakespeare's maybe there's multiple people, but probably not more than like 4 or 5 or something like that. I don't think it's the multiple authors that the New Testament talks about, especially with the Gospels. That's for sure. At least not the specific men that you talked about. You give the attribution to those men because it makes it look more real, because that's who that's who the story says walked with Jesus. But what you were talking about a few minutes ago was interesting, because what sparked in my mind was, Star Wars. Like, if you think about it, George Lucas started the Star Wars series with a completely different idea in mind of where the ending was going to go, and then Disney bought it, took it over, and completely did their own thing.
Yep.
It didn't match his, and from what I've read and what I understand, he did not care very much for what they decided to do with it, but nonetheless, their ending was wonderful. They found a way to, not everybody's going to think it was the best ending, but it doesn't matter. The point is, they ended it well. They brought all the pieces together, and they mined from a totally different person's original storyline, but completed it in a way that made sense, but did not go the way the original author intended. And I think the Bible's much the same way. And so we have brilliant writers, just like Disney does, mining the story of the Old Testament writers, whoever they were at the time, George Lucas parallel, and we have a great story, even though it didn't go the originally intended way.
So let's talk a little bit about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Okay.
What's going on there? Those the real authors? Are those real stories? Are they real, biographical accounts? What do you think is happening there?
I go back and forth, I guess, from day to day. Were these real people? Were they not? Was Jesus real? Was he not? Was James real? Was he not? Can we know? Can we not know? And that's the problem, is we can't know. There's no evidence to substantiate whether any of these people actually existed. There's enough to suggest the possibility, but nothing definitive. And so that's why there's kind of a split down the center. Did any of these people exist? Did they not? Are they just part of the story that these scribes wrote into the narrative to make it look realistic? And especially since Jesus is fulfilling all these prophecies, and these 4 gospel writers were Jesus's apostles, then of course, if we're going to make the story look real, let's attribute these gospels to these 4 apostles. And that makes sense. That's what you got to do if you're going to make the story look real. Were they real? Did they write them? I don't think they wrote them. That I don't think. I think definitely, especially since there's more evidence from studies that show that the New Testament was written, many, at least generation 2 after these guys even lived. So that tells you these guys aren't the original authors. That we know. But were they real? I don't know. Do we have any testimony from them, which again would be based on reconsolidated memory anyway? And so if any of it is actually based on true testimonies, even that would be reconsolidated. So let's just hypothetically say you got a couple of scribes, 100 years later writing this story. And let's just say hypothetically, they're actually interviewing people and getting details of this story. It's all reconsolidated. It's all exaggerated. It's all fish stories. And so none of it, you can't really say any of it's accurate anyway. So that would be, worst case scenario in what you're asking is these guys actually existed, or I guess I should say best case scenario for the Christian. These guys actually existed. Somebody interviewed them, who interviewed them, who interviewed them, and it finally got to the scribes who interviewed them, and they put the story together, and we play the telephone game, and you have the New Testament. You know what I'm saying? That would be the best case scenario of all we can pull together for the New Testament. Otherwise, no, I don't think any of this was written by those guys. No, not at all.
So remind our viewers, just because it's not a very common term, what reconsolidated memory is.
Sure. Reconsolidated memory is very similar to what happens on a computer. You type a Word document, and then you keep updating it and keep updating it and keep updating it. And every time a save happens, the original information that was there is saved over. And so you don't actually retain what was originally there. You have the new information. In much the same way, when you reconsolidate a memory, what actually happened originally is never actually what you remember. What you remember is the new save that you remembered. So every time you recount a memory of something, and not every type of memory, but particularly reconsolidated memory has to do with really intense experiences, things that are highly emotional, things of that sort. And out of the ordinary. So you have these intense experiences, and the next time you remember it, oh yeah, it was like this, when it really wasn't like that, but that's how you recall it because it's so exaggerated in your mind to begin with. Now you've just exaggerated it even more. And so it constantly changes. So, 40 years down the road, you're still remembering this memory, but it literally is nothing like you remembered it originally. I mean, that fish you caught is like this now. So that's literally reconsolidated memory, and it's just a reality. It's a scientific proof. Everybody does it, even with things that aren't exaggerated, but particularly the things that are, and that are emotional. So none of us remembers our past to the T exactly. We always have details that are kind of messed up, and the only way to really try to figure it out is to just go in with the empirical data from that event and try to piece things together. But to say your memory 100, I remember it was like that. Well, no, you probably don't remember it that accurately.
And that all begins with our own perception as well, because if 10 of us were standing around, we witnessed Jesus doing some event, they're going to have 10 different versions of that story.
Right.
Then as time goes on, those 10 versions are going to even get more and more, have more and more memory reconsolidation, so they're going to get even more and more different. So it all kind of goes together, right?
Yeah, and one of the things that you can see, and I think Bart Ehrman does a great job of this, Matt Dillahunty does a great job with this, several others, they go to show that the longer time passed from the original supposed timeline of the events happening to when they were finally written, you can actually see, even in the biblical narrative and through the years, how the developments of the miracles and the resurrection and all that started to get inserted into the text and became more glorified and more exaggerated, because originally that wasn't the story. Like when you look at Mark, who is the original supposed gospel writer, and the others are built on him, the last chapter of the resurrection, that was not in the original text. It gets added later. How that makes no sense if he's the original writer that the others are basing their story on. So now the others based their story on Mark, but somehow later his resurrection story gets added. This doesn't compute. There's something missing there. Something's going on. And I think it's because it retracted. They came back in later to make the other stories look like they were built on Mark.
And that's a really, really major point, I think, because Mark was the original gospel written, not by Mark, but it was the original gospel written. I think that's pretty much agreed to across scholars. Even biblical scholars are going to agree to that. And I think, all scholars agree that the last 16 verses were not there in the original version of Mark, which is the resurrection. So if the part about the resurrection was not in Mark, and this is the original one, how important was the resurrection to the original story. Can Christians have salvation without the resurrection?
Right. I mean, it's a great point. Apparently, it wasn't important to the original story, probably because it didn't happen in the original story.
Well, probably not, but it kind of like defeats the whole purpose of salvation altogether. Kind of, it destroys Christianity right there. I mean, it's almost like it was just a story.
Yeah.
And the guy died at the end, like they do in all the stories we watch, or or read, or watch, or listen to. Right? The guy dies in the end. That's it.
Yeah.
So
Bart Ehrman, who does happen now to, if I'm, it, you never know where he is from one day to the next. Just like with all of us, we're always learning. But it seems, I think he now thinks Jesus of Nazareth was an actual person. And Bart Ehrman, of course, is one of the most renowned historians right now in the world. I mean, he's really well known. Not that we have to agree with his assessment, because again, he's basing it on just little pieces of tidbits of evidence and stuff. And so he's saying, well, it's more than likely that he did exist and he didn't. He does not believe that he's the Messiah or some Christ or some son of God. He just thinks there's a man named Jesus of Nazareth who was a great motivational speaker, and much like Joseph Smith, got people to follow him. Even Bart says that even though this, in his mind, this Jesus of Nazareth probably existed, he never expected to be crucified. That was never a part of his mission. That was never a part of his. He just hoped to get followers, and next thing you know, he's being crucified. If that even happened, because there's not even a testimony that this Jesus of Nazareth was ever really crucified. So all of it's speculation. But I appreciate Bart's approach that if Jesus of Nazareth was real, which he thinks is more than likely, there's no verification that he was even crucified. But even if he was, which he might have been if that happened and he was just kind of a preacher, there's nothing to verify that he rose from the dead, and there's nothing to verify that any of this was part of his plan. There was no grandiose plan for him to come in and get crucified. I mean, who plans that for their life? I'm going to come in and plan to get crucified. Who does that? That would not make any sense unless you're the Son of God, who comes for that very purpose. But, we already know that that's not a reality. A Son of God coming down, dying and resurrecting, that doesn't happen in real life. That only happens in stories.
that's right. So I do want to talk about Bart Ehrman for just a minute, because this was a huge, huge, huge part of my deconstruction. And so, first of all, we are not going to go into the details in this series that, is a complement to your book. We're not going to go into the details of why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. We're not going to go into them here, you and I. But I do want to recommend to everybody, if you have not read all of Bart Ehrman's books, I'm just going to put a plug in for Bart Ehrman. I get nothing for doing this, but it really, really, really rocked my world and that was what helped me go, in a different direction. And so he really goes into in-depth detail on, every reason why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not write those gospels. But the other books are well worth reading as well. I don't remember which book that one was, because I just read all of his. Boom, 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 boom. When I started reading them, it was like, oh, let me see everything he has. So Bart Ehrman is an interesting, and then we'll go on here, but he's an interesting person because he, I think, has made more atheists than anyone else. Because when you read his books, that not only were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John not written by those four supposed gospel writers, but half of Paul's epistles were not written by Paul, and half of the other books were not written by those people as well, like Peter and James. So, so Bart Ehrman does a really, really good job. If anybody here, sometimes I get requests for, what can I learn? What can I read? What can I study? I would recommend you study all of Bart Ehrman's books. Now, Bart Ehrman has this position that the historical Jesus still lived, and his evidence for that is the internal evidence of the scripture that Paul said that 500 people saw him. That's his only evidence for that. So when we look at all the other evidence for whether or not Jesus existed, it is kind of funny that Bart Ehrman destroys all of the other internal evidence, but that's the one that he holds on to. And so he calls himself an agnostic. He is not an atheist, but more people have become atheists from reading his books than any other person that I'm aware of. So plug for Bart Ehrman. All right. let's talk about Paul before we run out of time here. So, so already I just mentioned that Paul only wrote like probably half the books that are attributed to him. So Paul, first of all, was he an eyewitness of Jesus or anything that Jesus did?
No, the only eyewitness testimony Paul even grants to himself is that he saw him in some vision where he was resurrected from the dead.
And
And
how is that any different from Joseph Smith's vision again? Remind me.
exactly none. That's that's the crazy thing. None. There's no difference. And let's just say Paul did, for all intents and purposes. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, Paul did write all the works that are attributed to him. Okay, that's great. But all we have then is a Joseph Smith testimony of him speaking to this guy named Jesus from a cloud, and two guys next to him saw it too, even though those two guys aren't there to verify it. Just Paul says they saw it, and then Paul telling us that 500 other people saw it, even though they're not around to verify that Paul's testimony. It's just literally one dude marching around, writing a bunch of stuff, saying, "Hey guys, I saw this. These people saw it. That person saw it. Those people saw it. Everybody saw it. You just gotta trust me. Just trust me. Me and my posse. We saw like that's what's going on here. It's Joseph Smith repeated. It's just mind blowing to me, and somehow we all fell for it, hook, line, and sinker.
Yep. So now Paul, this I didn't realize this until I started studying about the Bible instead of just studying in the Bible. Okay. So Paul was the first one basically to write any books. The Gospels were written after most of Paul's epistles, not all of them, but most of Paul's epistles. So he started writing first. And what do you remember what Paul says about Jesus himself? Does he tell any stories about Jesus? Does he talk about his birth? Does he talk about his miracles? Does he talk about where he lived? Does he talk about his family? Does he talk about anything about Jesus here on earth?
No, ironically, the only thing he talks about is his resurrection, the miracle of the resurrection, which was probably added later anyway to assist Paul because, you know, that wasn't a real thing that Paul probably came up with himself, but who knows? Maybe he did. But that's quite literally the only thing that we have from Paul about Jesus's life.
So the only thing that Paul has is this dream about Jesus, that he was died, that he buried, and that he was resurrected on the third day. That's literally all that we have from Paul.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose aside from the one reference back to the Lord's Supper that he had with in 1 Corinthians 11, the Lord's Supper where he broke bread, because he uses that to teach us, how to, do the Lord's Supper. But aside from that, that's the only other, from my recollection, any knowledge of Jesus's life outside of the resurrection. Yeah.
So that's a pretty Gnostic position, isn't it? So Gnosticism is something that when I was in church, I was told it was this horrible, horrible, horrible position that you can't take in Christianity. But it's basically where it's a more spiritual happening, things that are happening, in the spiritual world and not really here in the physical realm. And so Paul doesn't talk about anything that happens here on earth. He's just talking about these dreams that he's had or what he heard from other people. So Paul basically was Gnostic, which is kind of covered up in our Americanized, modernized, Anglicized versions of the Bible, right? So, so Paul, he doesn't really give a lot of credence to Jesus other than this dream that he had. And everything else that he does is Paul's idea of theology. So does he get his theology from Jesus?
Well, I mean, you're asking me. No, he does not get his theology from Jesus. That's for sure. I mean, at least not Christ, the resurrected Jesus. And since Paul wasn't around when Jesus was walking around, even if Jesus of Nazareth was real, no, he definitely didn't get his theology from Jesus. And he definitely didn't get it from the Christ Jesus version either. The legend. No, Paul is making this up. In fact, it's interesting that, we have so much conflict between Paul and the other apostles in the Bible.
Hmm.
It's, and as a Christian, because you are predisposed to believe the Bible is true and there's no errors in it, you find ways to merge these conflicts and these contradictions. And the reason was because Paul had to correct Peter's thinking because Peter was off. But then they get the gospel right, and so and you just you play gymnastics constantly trying to figure out why Paul and the apostles are in constant conflict. It's probably because these other guys in reality were just normal dudes, if they were even real, living their life. And in comes Paul, and he's trying to create this theology, and he's a charismatic guy, and so now he's creating conflict, but he's got followers. So you can't just beat the shit out of him and get him out of town. You gotta work with him. I don't know. This is just kind of my speculation on what's happening here. If these guys are even real, we're making a lot of assumptions here too to begin with that they're real. That's the first assumption. But if they're real, these are some ways to look at it. But why is there so much conflict between them? Trying to square it through the lens of faith alone, it doesn't work, because then you still got James to contend with. Oh, but we have James. We got him figured out too. James didn't mean faith without works is dead. No, he meant faith works. There's so much problems, but you square, Christian. You find a way, don't you, Jen?
So we don't have evidence. Like, do we have any evidence? I'm going to go back to the Gospels here for a minute. Do we have any evidence that the stories in the Gospels about Jesus were true? Do we have any evidence for any of the stories about Jesus?
Outside of the Bible, no.
Okay. And so the four Gospels we have no evidence for that it actually happened. We do have a lot of evidence that they pulled in stories all over. We have a ton of evidence that they pulled in other stories and that they combined them and made these four Gospels. We have a ton of evidence for that, right? And then for Paul, so half the books that Paul wrote, he didn't really write, but the other half, he was based on a dream, making up a theology. So how is that any different from all the theological debates and discussions that we have on Facebook or wherever people have all of these debates and discussions today, where people choose, I'm a Calvinist, I'm an Arminian, I'm a four-pointer, I'm a, whatever, or, I'm a dispensationalist, I'm pre-mill, I'm post-mill, I'm, I'm a preterist, I'm all these different things. So we have all kinds of doctrines and all kinds of theologies today. How is that any different where we are extrapolating, right, from a book and we're coming up with our own theory, our own doctrines, right? How is that any different from what Paul did, where he extrapolated from some of the Old Testament, some of it from his mind? How is that any different? What do you think?
I mean, I suppose from the perspective that, at least from mine and I think your current perspective, I would say that it is no different because all of it is being pulled from a mythology anyway. So in that sense, we're basing our theological views on mythology and living it as though it's reality. So from that perspective, it's no different. We're doing exactly what Paul did, essentially. It's just we're taking one step further. Oh, and now we're basing it on Paul and the Old Testament. So we just got the additional layer. But no, most of it's not like that. Like, I will tell you from my conversations, and I've had quite a few since I've had test cases read this book, and I've been interacting with them. The ones that have remained Christians after reading the book, without any question whatsoever, every single one of them, unequivocally, their reason to remain a Christian is not that there's any evidence whatsoever. They admit there's no evidence. They won't even admit that it's faith alone. The reason is I had an experience. God spoke to me. I encountered an angel. I heard angels sing, on and on, yada, yada. Whatever your experience, or even some very chilling thing that happened to you, and it was just too chilling for it to not be God. How is this possible that this random thing happened?
So I'm going to stop you right there, just because that's like going to be our whole next show.
Mhm.
And we have just a minute left on this one. So I want to just kind of wrap up where we are with the New Testament. So we have no evidence for the Gospels. Paul's making up his own theology. Half of his books are not written by him. We don't know who
But,
wrote them.
but mind you, he's basing it on what he claims is an experience.
That's true.
That was the point I was making.
All based on, yeah, it's all based on this dream, right, that he had, right?
Mhm.
And then the rest of the books, Peter and James and one of John's are probably not written by who they are attributed to as well. So really, what do we have left? And there's the timer, but I want to answer this question real quick. What do we have left in the New Testament to hold on to?
Nothing.
Nothing. And
There we go.
just like with the addiction that you need to quit, once the brainwashing has been removed, you just pick a time and you stop.
That's right. And don't leave just yet. I want to encourage you to make sure you subscribe, like, and drop a comment right below. And if you want to join our fast growing community of ex-Christians on Facebook, also click the link that's in the description below. We would love to have you if you are on that part of your journey.
Now, if you found value in this week's discussion, you can drop a tip in the tip jar if you want. We'll be back next week, continuing to peel back the layers of religious conditioning and brainwashing. So until next time, question your faith with answers from Genesis.